It started on a Wednesday night. One of those evenings that was supposed to be quiet, the kind where the dishwasher hums, and the TV flickers in the background while no one really watches. We were halfway through leftovers, sitting across from each other at the kitchen island. I had just mentioned, softly, cautiously, that the credit card statement looked a little higher than usual. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even framed as a question. Just an observation. The kind of thing a partner should be able to bring up. But his reaction? Immediate. Sharp. He dropped his fork with a loud clatter against the ceramic plate, leaned back in his chair, and rolled his eyes with the theatrical exhaustion of a man who believed he'd been burdened with too much. "God, you always do this," he muttered. "You get so emotional about money." The words hit like cold water down my spine. Not because they were unfamiliar, but because this time, he didn't even bother dressing them up. No charm. No fake softness. Just the raw dismissal I had felt for years, finally said aloud. "You're too emotional to handle finances," he said again, slower, like it needed repeating for emphasis. "This is exactly why I take care of it." He picked up his fork and kept eating, like that settled it. Like the topic was closed, like he had just finished explaining something to a child and was ready to move on. I didn't respond right away. I didn't yell. Didn't cry. I just sat there, still and silent, while something inside me rewired itself. It wasn't the first time he'd said something patronizing. It wasn't even the first time he'd implied that I couldn't be trusted with serious matters. But this time, something shifted. Not in him, in me. Something that had been dormant. Something that had tolerated years of being talked down to, brushed aside, made to feel like my concern was a flaw instead of a strength. This wasn't about the statement. It was about the pattern. I thought back to all the times I had asked about our mortgage and he'd smirked. "Don't stress about it." All the times I had asked about savings and he told me I wouldn't understand how it all worked. The accounts I didn't have access to. The passwords I stopped asking for. The way he would wave a hand and tell me, "Just leave it to me." And I did. I left it to him, because pushing made me the nag, and worrying made me unstable. But I wasn't unstable. I was right to worry. I wasn't emotional. I was observant. And suddenly, I could see every small moment I had swallowed. The purchases he didn't explain. The bills that came in late. The vague explanations about investments. The times I covered a shortfall without even mentioning it, just to keep the peace. I had been managing the damage control while he took all the credit for keeping us afloat. And now, he was telling me I was the liability? That night, I didn't argue. I didn't correct him. I didn't say a word. I just nodded slowly and said, "Okay." He smiled. Smug. Satisfied. Like he'd won something. But what he didn't realize was that in that moment, I stopped trying to fix things for him. I stopped cleaning up behind him. I stopped running interference with the creditors, stopped checking the accounts to make sure we were okay. Because if I was too emotional to be involved, then I wouldn't be. I would let him lead. I would let him fall. And when he finally did, I wouldn't raise my voice. I would just hand him the paper. You don't realize you've been gaslit until you stop questioning your own sanity. That night at the kitchen table, when he told me I was too emotional to handle finances, I didn't just hear his words. I heard every time he'd made me feel small, ridiculous, unqualified. And I started seeing how those moments weren't isolated. They were stitched together, forming a pattern so precise it could have been intentional, though I don't even think he knew how deliberate his cruelty had become. I hadn't always been excluded from the money. When we were first married, I offered to handle the bills. I liked structure. I liked spreadsheets. I even enjoyed balancing accounts. It gave me a sense of control, of peace. But every time I brought it up, he'd tell me not to stress. "You're always worrying," he'd say. Let me take care of it. It's not your job to carry all that. Back then, it sounded kind. Generous, even. Like he was protecting me from stress. Only later did I understand it wasn't about protection. It was about power. He didn't want to share the financial burden. He wanted to control it. Not because he was good at it, but because it made him feel superior. Every time I'd ask where we stood with the mortgage, he'd laugh. Why do you always assume the worst? If I brought up the credit card debt creeping higher, he'd sigh and shake his head. You can't live life worrying about every number. You're going to give yourself a breakdown. But I wasn't having a breakdown. I was having clarity. He had spent years slowly cutting me off from the information I had a right to see, turning shared decisions into private ones, cloaking facts in charm and jokes, and making me feel like I was paranoid for noticing. It was a slow erosion of trust, and I hadn't even realized how far it had gone. I stopped seeing statements. Stopped receiving alerts. Even the login credentials changed. He said the bank just updated their system, but somehow, he never got around to giving me access again. He positioned me as someone who couldn't handle stress, who overthought everything, who would only freak out if she saw the numbers. And after enough times hearing it, I started to believe it. I started second-guessing myself. I told myself I was overreacting. That he was the responsible one. That maybe he really did know better. Until he said it out loud. You're too emotional to handle money. There it was, the lie, uncloaked. But now I was awake. And the version of me he'd trained, the one that apologized for asking questions, the one who stayed quiet when something didn't feel right, that version was gone. She had been replaced by someone methodical. Focused. Cold, even. I began pulling threads, one by one. While he played the confident husband, I played the silent archivist. I started checking mail more thoroughly. Not opening anything, not yet, but noticing the patterns. The number of final notice envelopes increasing. The envelopes that came from creditors I didn't recognize. I started taking photos with my phone when he left them lying around. Just in case. When he left for work, I went online. I reset passwords using old information I remembered from when we first opened accounts. Birthdays, dog names, anniversary dates. It took time, but I got back in. What I found made my stomach twist: 3 maxed-out credit cards. A second mortgage I never signed off on. A savings account with less than $200. And most of all, a mortgage that had already been paid late twice in the past 4 months. It wasn't just mismanagement. It was a collapse waiting to happen. And he didn't even know how close we were to drowning. But I did. And this time, I wouldn't be the one to plug the holes. I'd let the ship go down, and let him see who had really been keeping it afloat. The thing about pride is that it doesn't recognize its own reflection until it shatters. My husband had always carried himself like a man who had everything under control: the house, the finances, the future. He had built an identity around the illusion of competence, convinced that being loud, decisive, and dismissive equaled wisdom. But wisdom doesn't forget to pay bills. It doesn't rack up debt while buying flat screens and convincing your wife everything's fine. And now that I was looking more closely, I saw the cracks in everything. I noticed the way he flinched when the phone rang during dinner, how he'd silence it without checking who it was. How he'd glance at the mailbox but leave it untouched until it was nearly overflowing. I started tracking the pattern: credit card bills arriving mid-month, payment reminders slipping under the radar. I stopped reminding him. I didn't bring up the notices. I didn't mention the red envelopes marked urgent or the letters stamped with words like delinquent, final attempt, or collection pending. If I asked, he'd just lie. So I stopped asking. He didn't realize I had stopped fixing things. That had always been my silent role in the relationship, the fixer behind the curtain. I was the one who caught the overdraft fees and quietly moved money from my personal savings to avoid penalties. I was the one who called the electric company when he forgot to pay, smoothing things over with a half-lie about mail delays. I was the one who stayed up late recalculating our monthly expenses after he made an unplanned purchase. But no more. If I was too emotional, too dramatic, too sensitive, then I would simply watch. Calmly. Rationally. Strategically. The more I pulled back, the more he fumbled. There were missed calls from the mortgage company. Emails that sat unread, their subject lines screaming things he pretended not to hear. I found a new loan document in a drawer one morning while putting away laundry, one I hadn't signed. A second refinance, with worse terms than the first, buried under 3 pages of legal jargon he clearly hadn't read. The interest rate alone made my chest tighten. He had used the house as collateral, again. Only this time, it was to pay off personal credit debt. Thousands gone. Risk traded for momentary relief. I made a copy of every document. Scanned them. Printed 2 sets, one for safekeeping, one for the lawyer I would speak to later. I organized them chronologically, highlighting signatures, flagging concerning clauses, color-coding patterns of negligence. While he went to sleep at night bragging about his work bonus, I sat quietly at the kitchen table documenting the downfall he didn't know he was engineering. The house was weeks away from triggering formal foreclosure proceedings. I knew it before he did, because I'd spoken to someone at the bank using a POA I'd had notarized years earlier, back when we refinanced the first time and needed my name to boost approval. He'd forgotten that tiny detail. But I hadn't. I knew where we stood. I knew how deep the debt was. And I knew what was coming next. But I didn't tell him. I let him keep playing the confident provider. I let him brag to his friends over poker night. I let him buy a new watch and show it off at the office party. I smiled beside him, made polite conversation, and kept his image intact, all while knowing he was weeks away from losing everything. He had made it clear, I was too emotional to be involved. So I gave him what he claimed he wanted. Full control. And when the storm hit, he'd have no one left to blame but himself. Because I wasn't silent out of weakness anymore. I was quiet because I had the evidence. And when the moment was right, I'd hand him the truth, with a signature. There was a strange sense of peace in the silence. For the first time in years, I wasn't racing to catch the falling pieces of his chaos. I wasn't patching up the finances or making excuses for missed payments. I wasn't intercepting calls from creditors or moving money around to cover his forgetfulness. I just let it all unfold, exactly as he had built it. I no longer felt anxious, I felt clear. Focused. Like someone watching a fire they didn't start finally burn itself out. The foreclosure notice didn't come out of nowhere. I saw the early warnings. I saw the emails, the red letter envelopes, the escalation. I even received a courtesy call from the mortgage company. My name was still on file, even if he had removed me from every conversation. They were polite. I was calmer than they expected. I asked a few smart questions, took notes, and thanked them for their time. Then I went back to cooking dinner like nothing happened. He was still living in his illusion, checking out furniture catalogs, talking about repainting the living room. He made a passing comment about upgrading the kitchen once the next bonus hits. I said nothing. There was no bonus coming. His company had been downsizing for months, but he never looked beyond his own bubble of confidence. He believed that as long as he looked successful, he was successful. That if he wore nice watches and drove a polished car, the numbers in our accounts would magically align. But numbers don't lie. They're not emotional. They're not reactive. They just reveal the truth, silently and without mercy. And that truth was simple: the house was no longer ours. He had borrowed against it so many times, we were barely holding on to the title. And now, with his spending unchecked and his ego bloated, he'd missed one payment too many. The mortgage company wasn't threatening anymore, they were preparing. Preparing to reclaim what he had gambled. And he hadn't even opened the envelope. I placed it on the counter one evening, deliberately. Right beside his favorite coffee mug. He came home late, grumbled about traffic, kissed my cheek, and made a comment about grabbing takeout tomorrow. He picked up the envelope, glanced at the sender, and frowned. "More junk mail," he said, tossing it toward the junk drawer. I didn't move. "Maybe open that one," I said softly. He paused. Looked at me. Something in my tone must have struck a chord, because he picked it up again and carefully peeled the flap open. His eyes scanned the first line. Then the second. Then the paragraph in bold. I watched the color drain from his face. This isn't real," he said, voice shaking. "There must be a mistake." I said nothing. He kept reading, panic tightening his voice. "They're saying we've missed 3 payments? That they've already started proceedings? Why didn't I know about this?" He looked at me now, desperate. "Why didn't you tell me?" "That was rich." "I tried," I replied. "But every time I brought up a concern, you told me I was overreacting. Too emotional. So I stopped." I figured the man who controls everything would notice when the ground beneath him started to crack. He slumped into the chair, holding the letter like it might change if he stared long enough. I slid a folder across the table. Inside, copies of every document, every email, every bank statement, every refinance paper, every credit card statement. Color-coded. Chronological. Ironclad. "You didn't just miss payments," I said. "You signed a second refinance on the house using my name. You maxed out 3 cards and consolidated the debt without fixing the spending. You created this mess, and you made sure I couldn't speak without being belittled." He opened the folder. His hands were trembling. He had no defense. And for the first time since we'd met, he looked at me not like a child, not like a wife, not like someone to be managed, but like a force he never saw coming. He'd underestimated me. But the bank didn't. And now, neither would he. He didn't speak for a long time after reading the letter. He just sat at the table, eyes fixed on the foreclosure notice like it was written in a language he didn't understand. His fingers tapped against the paper, slow and rhythmless, as if he was trying to think his way out of the consequences. I watched him with a kind of detachment I hadn't felt before. I wasn't angry anymore. That had burned off weeks ago. What remained was colder, quieter, the kind of clarity that comes after grief. "I didn't know it got this bad," he finally said. Of course he didn't. He hadn't known much of anything for a while now. He had stopped looking. He had stopped listening. And when I tried to tell him, he dismissed me. Every warning, every flag, every quiet, measured suggestion, all brushed aside because he didn't like the tone I used, or the timing, or the way I asked questions. It had always been easier for him to say I was emotional than to admit he was careless. "I thought the payments were automatic," he added, as if that explained everything. "They were," I said. "Until you changed the account routing and forgot to update the system. That was 4 months ago." He blinked. "You knew?" I nodded. "I've known a lot more than you think." I watched his shoulders sag under the weight of those words. He looked smaller somehow, not in stature, but in presence. The man who once stood over me in arguments, puffed with authority and condescension, now folded into himself. He looked human. And for the first time, I realized how much of his power came from my belief in it. Once that belief was gone, he was just a man with bad habits and worse instincts. "I didn't mean to," he started, but I stopped him. "You didn't mean to lose the house. I get it. But you did. And you didn't just lose it, you dragged me into the fire while calling me crazy for smelling the smoke." He opened his mouth again, but no words came out. Instead, he reached for the folder I'd left him, the one with all the documentation, and flipped through it like he could somehow reverse engineer the damage. "We can fix this," he said, more to himself than to me. We can negotiate, call the bank, maybe sell off some things. We? I said, folding my arms. That's rich. He looked up. And that's when I told him what I'd already done. I've spoken to a lawyer. My name isn't on the deed anymore. You had it removed during the last refinance, remember? You needed a higher income ratio to qualify. You signed everything alone. That means you're solely liable for the mortgage. His face went pale. But, the accounts. I've separated mine. Months ago. I moved my money. I have statements to prove it. My credit is clean. I've documented everything, your authorizations, your signatures, the dates of the missed payments. I made sure I wouldn't be legally tied to your negligence. He stared at me like he didn't recognize the person in front of him. The woman he had underestimated, dismissed, quieted, now speaking with absolute control. Not rage. Not vindictiveness. Just cold, calm facts. So what? He asked slowly. You're just walking away. I tilted my head. You told me I couldn't handle money because I was too emotional. I believed you for a while. But the truth is, I wasn't emotional. I was just trying to save us. And when I stopped trying, everything collapsed. He lowered his head into his hands. I didn't think it would go this far. It always goes this far, I said. You just never noticed because I was always there to catch it. I stood up, grabbed my keys, and left the folder on the table. I had one more meeting the next day, the final signature on the new lease for the apartment I would be moving into alone. The house was no longer my problem. And neither was he. I moved out 3 days before the final foreclosure notice was scheduled to be served in person. It was surreal, packing my things from the very house I'd once thought I'd grow old in. Every drawer I opened reminded me of how much I had held together in silence. The house had absorbed so much, whispered arguments behind closed doors, quiet heartbreak, sleepless nights, unspoken worries. I ran my hand along the kitchen counter one last time, remembering how many nights I'd stood there, calculator in hand, trying to stretch pennies into peace. It hadn't worked. But it wasn't for lack of trying. When I walked out, he was home. Sitting on the edge of the couch, staring blankly at the television. Not watching, not reacting, just existing, suspended in disbelief. I told him I'd be gone by the evening. That I had a new lease. That I had my own space now. His mouth opened slightly, like he might protest, but no sound came. He just nodded. Slowly. Dazed. He didn't ask me to stay. I think he knew better now. I think he finally understood that this wasn't just about money, it was about disrespect. About the years he spent telling me I was incapable, while relying on me to quietly hold up everything behind the scenes. It was about the times he twisted my concern into hysteria, and my foresight into fear. When someone tells you you're too emotional, what they're really saying is, I don't want to be held accountable. And when they say it often enough, you stop trying to protect them. And I had. I left behind the keys and a copy of the lawyer's letter explaining my legal disassociation from the house. I had withdrawn from the joint accounts. I had no outstanding debts under his name. He would face the bank alone, the calls, the paperwork, the consequences. It wasn't revenge. It was math. Choices with prices. 2 weeks later, I received a final update from the lawyer. The foreclosure had proceeded. The house was being repossessed. I felt nothing. No triumph. No sadness. Just completion. The chapter had ended. And I hadn't been crushed by it, I had walked out with my name intact and my dignity sharper than ever. Sometimes people ask me if I ever heard from him again. I did. A few texts here and there. One said, I miss how you made things feel stable. Another said, I was under pressure, you know. The last one just said, I'm sorry. But I never replied. Because I wasn't interested in closure from him. I'd already built it myself. I was sitting on the balcony of my new apartment the night that final message came. A modest place, not large, not fancy, but fully mine. Rent paid on time. No secrets in the mail. No hidden loans hiding in drawers. No second-guessing my instincts or tiptoeing around fragile egos. Just quiet. Honest quiet. I lit a candle on the railing and poured a glass of wine. Not to celebrate his downfall, but to honor my escape. I looked out at the skyline and smiled, remembering the version of me who used to apologize before every financial question. The woman who once believed she was too emotional to be trusted with numbers. She'd been wrong, but not about herself. She had trusted the wrong person. And when she stopped, everything changed. Because the truth is, emotion doesn't make you weak. Ignoring it does. And when I finally stopped ignoring my instincts, I didn't just take back control. I took back me.